Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's kind of been a while since I last posted, but today I'm back with a colored pencil tutorial / tips video. I recently finished this drawing of Gollum from Lord of the Rings, and before that I had done a drawing of Frodo as well. I've done a few different series so far in 2020 that I was thinking about showing in another video because I've done a lot of themes. But anyway, the theme I did this time was Lord of the Rings, and these were the two portraits I did both in colored pencil. So I thought I would share some colored pencil tips for you guys, for any of you who are interested in learning how to improve your colored pencil portrait. Alright, so the first portrait I'm going to kind of talk about is the one I did of Gollum. And I know that he's a little bit creepy and scary looking. If any of you have seen any of my really early videos, you know that I like to draw horror movie characters and things like that. So he is a little bit scary. Sorry if that's off-putting, but I think the drawing turned out really good, so I did want to share some tips with you. My first tip is to really focus on making sure that the eyes look glossy and detailed. Not just the iris and the pupils, of course, you also want to pay attention to the whites of the eyes and the inner corners and the skin around the eyes. So the inner corners of the eyes are actually quite dark, and you want to make sure that you really build up that contrast. And the skin around the eyes, there are some kind of folds and creases and things like that that you don't want to miss either, because it adds a new level of detail. Now for the irises, I like to make sure my pencil is super sharp when I work on them so that I can get the correct level of detail as well. I also like to add a super white highlight to the eye with a gel pen or gouache or something like that, so I'm going to go back and do that later. And I realized I'm moving through this kind of fast. I kind of skipped through a lot of the clips and tried to just leave some of the more important parts in and just make this a little bit more condensed, since I'm showing two drawings here from my Lord of the Rings series. With that being said, let me move on to my second tip for colored pencil portraits. And that is to not focus too much on the different colors, but more to focus on where the shadows, midtones, and highlights are. So when I first was learning colored pencil portraits, I was really confused about what colors to use. So I would just watch other people's speed drawings and try to see what colors they were using, and I thought that I just needed to buy all of those colors and then I would be fine, because I was only used to working with graphite before that, so I didn't really know how to do anything besides value and contrast. But I learned over the years that with colors, you do want to try to match the colors as best you can to the picture that you're using, of course. But what's most important is that the colors blend together nicely and create a look of shadow and highlight, and that you get different values through your drawing. So even if you don't have the exact shade of brown or flesh tone or any tone for the eyes that you think you might need, as long as you're able to kind of create a contrast with a darker pencil and a lighter pencil, and you know how to create shadows versus highlights, then you will be fine, and don't worry too much about all of the different colors. Now that being said, if you're new to colored pencil portraits, it might benefit you to do some practice and try and blend some skin tones on your own before you try and actually create a portrait, because I know that I was getting the weirdest tones when I first tried to do colored pencil portraits, so it does take a little bit of practice. But overall, focus on the shadows and the highlights, and maybe adding in a few different tones so that you don't have a totally flat looking drawing, but don't overly focus on very specific colors that you might need. Another thing you can do is pick a reference photo that has fairly high contrast in it, so you can clearly see the darker areas versus the lighter areas, and you're kind of able to create different areas and contrast of skin tone that way, because I kind of found it harder to color in a photo that looked a little bit more flat and didn't have a variation of contrast, because I would just end up getting a flat result and it was frustrating. So I do recommend maybe choosing a high contrast photo or upping the contrast in the reference photo you're using a little bit. Edit the photo a little so that you can clearly see which areas are going to be darkest, and then your mid values and your highlights as well. Now I know you won't always want to do dramatic, you don't always want to create a dramatic style. Of course, if you're doing fan art or characters for movies or TV shows, often the photos you use are going to be somewhat dramatic, because TV shows and movies are dramatic. But if you're not wanting to get too much of a dramatic look, Upping the contrast in your photo will still help you to see where those shadows and highlights are. You don't have to edit it drastically, but just a little bit if you're having trouble with figuring out where the different tones need to be. Now let's move on to tip number 3, and arguably I think it's the most important tip. So the biggest thing when you're doing a portrait in colored pencil obviously is the skin. Please ignore the fact that I'm drawing a hobbit here because I'm still using the same techniques for skin as I would with a normal person, and you'll see me work on the skin with Frodo in a bit as well. But I do a specific kind of technique when I'm working on skin. I build up layers first with pretty light to medium pressure, and then as I add more and more layers, when I feel that I have enough pigment down, I want to get rid of the grain. And when I go to get rid of the grain, I can actually go and place a little bit more pressure with my pencil, use a little bit more pressure, glaze more colors over the top, and eventually I can actually press a bit harder like I have done in some of the highly shadowed areas. The key here is to be patient, because if you darken up areas or use too much pressure too early on, what happens is you can't add more colors over the top later. You'll be able to add a little bit, but you won't be able to add very much. So you might end up with a flat looking drawing if you've burnished too soon, and burnishing is when you press very hard with your pencil to get rid of the grain. There are other ways, of course, to get rid of that pencil grain. You can use solvent, things like that, but those are totally different techniques, and I'm just talking specifically about how you can blend skin with pencils only. So be very careful with burnishing, and you can also see that I added the hair in after I burnished his head and also the shoulder area, and the only reason I was able to do that was because I was using kind of a harder pressure to create the wet strands of hair, because that was the look. So I knew that it would glaze over on top of the pencil I'd already burnished. But if you're looking to create like softer details, you want to make sure you add those in before burnishing. If you want to create crisper, fine details at the end, you'll still be able to probably do that as long as you're using a harder pressure with your pencil. It's very, very important to build up those skin tone layers, and since skin is very smooth as well, you want to make sure that it does not look grainy in the end, so it requires either burnishing or a lot of layers or something like a solvent, as I've mentioned before. Now really quickly, I'm going in and kind of adding additional details at the end to the eye that I thought needed to be there, and I do go in with my white gel pen and add the highlight, and I think that does make a difference and kind of makes the eyes look more glossy and gives more life to the drawing. So I do recommend using some kind of gel pen or maybe white paint to create a white highlight on the eye, because most photos do have that highlight shining on the iris or pupil of the eye. I also want to mention, when you are creating skin tones and things like that, paper matters as well, so you might want to try a couple different papers until you really get a texture that you like, because sometimes it's really hard to get rid of any sort of texture or tooth of the paper showing through, and you'll still have a little bit of grain. So in this drawing I'm using Strathmore mixed media paper, and since it is mixed media paper, it's a bit thicker and it does have a little bit of a texture, and it is sometimes hard to get rid of grain, but it does take a ton of layers. So it's great for building up skin tone, and I think that most paper that is thicker or has more tooth to it will work. But if you're using something very thin like a sketch paper, you probably won't be able to get in too many additional layers, and skin is going to be a bit harder for you to build up in that case. I do tend to feel like I get a little bit like disorganized or rambly in my videos, so really quickly I'm going to go over those first 3 tips. The first one was to work really hard on the eye area and make sure you don't miss anything. Make sure you create that contrast in the inner creases and those details on the iris with a sharp pencil. And the second tip was to focus more on highlights, shadows, and contrast rather than specific colors. And then the third thing I talked about was keeping light to medium pressure and not really using hard pressure or burnishing until you've built up enough layers, especially for the skin tone. That's how you really build up a lot of layers without running out of tooth of your paper. I'm going to go ahead and move over to the Frodo drawing that I did now, which I don't have as many clips for, but I'm going to kind of speed through this and talk about a couple more things. The fourth tip I have is to not be afraid to use kind of odd colors in your skin tone or even in the eye area or the hair if you do see them. So I noticed some blues and greens in my reference photo, and I did try my best to incorporate that because it really does add another level of depth and dimension into the skin tone. If you're new with this, you kind of have to be careful to make sure you're still neutralizing those colors out with actual skin tones like browns or flesh tones so that you don't have like a blue overpowering anything. You also don't want to use a super bright color that's going to overpower the rest of the colors, but don't be afraid to add in some colors that you might see. Some common ones are purples, reds, or even sometimes oranges, blues or greens, but you want to be careful, make sure you don't add too much, just a little bit at first and see how it looks, and of course layer a flesh or a brown tone or whatever tone you're using on top of that color so that it kind of evens it out and mutes it a little bit. And it is kind of going to look weird at first too, like having all those different colors. You kind of just have to build it up and see how things come together more in the end. And I always think that my colored pencil drawings look very weird at the start and I just don't like how they look, but I persevere through it and I push through and I keep working on it, and I usually pretty much always like how it turns out in the end. So it really just is a matter of building up the layers, and you won't always like how it looks at first. But if you look closely, you can see I do have purples and greens, a little bit of blue, of course normal like brown shadowed areas as well. So you don't always have to stick to a palette of like specific skin colors. If you do see something else in your reference photo, don't be afraid to try it, and it's going to make your drawing look really cool and dimensional. But you might want to practice on a separate piece of paper first to make sure it's not going to overpower everything. Now, if this is a little bit overwhelming or you don't have a huge color of palettes to start out with, just focus on practicing your skin tones to begin with, and don't worry too much about having a huge range of colors or adding in too many tones if you don't want to. I'm just going to go over one more tip. In this clip, I'm kind of working on his clothing, and I just wanted to mention that you kind of have to practice using different techniques for different textures. His clothing was very kind of like fuzzy looking, and I kind of used circular motions and left a little bit of texture, and I definitely didn't create a smooth look the same way I did with the skin. And I even created little kind of fuzzy areas coming off of the top of his clothing on his shoulder. So you can do that as well. And if you are working on hair, of course, you're going to use a certain texture. If you're working on clothing, you might use a linear texture depending on what you're doing. You might use a linear technique of coloring, or if it's fuzzy, you might use a circular motion the way that I did. I kind of colored in a lot of tiny little circles and left a bit of texture to kind of create that look. And that's all I had for this video today, guys. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I just wanted to share a few different tips that I came up with for colored pencil portraiture. So I hope that this helped you guys, and thank you so much for watching this video. Please leave a comment and let me know what you thought about it, or what kind of videos you'd like to see in the future, or even just tell me what you think of my Lord of the Rings series drawings. So I will see you guys in the next video, and again, thank you so much for watching. Bye guys!